as soon as he joins. Big week. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our first edition of Q4's Regenerative Finance Aligned Voter Committee subcommittee meeting. I am your cruise director, Kianga, and really excited to welcome you all. Some of you are rather new to the call. We have, although actually hasn't joined us just yet, our new AD, but we have Assad from Centrifuge. Welcome. Yay.
Hi, everybody.
And so I'm gonna be very brief, and so that we can spend all of the time with Assad and the exciting proposal and work that he will talk about. But just for a little bit of intro and housekeeping, all of you all who are in this room know very well we've transitioned from quarters, starting a new quarter in the governance season. And next week's meeting, for the delegates who are here, we will have more of an internal ABC discussion, no special guests. And, I think the support scope will be a good opportunity to talk about some of the things that most of you all mentioned in your reports for this week, a little more of the housekeeping things that, are going on with Sovereign Finance's request for reviews and, just some of the kind of sausage making of what we do here. So we'll have time to get into that next week, as well as, go into a little more detail about our governance strategy and how we are going to be operating as an ABC this quarter for the rest of this year. So we'll save that for next week. And I've put some comments in the regular Refi ABC channel, so we can always just asynchronously chat about things. I'd love to do that more this quarter as well. So without further ado, I want to thank you, Assad, for coming and also congratulate you and your team on a fantastic first annual Real World Asset Summit in New York that I was able to attend. And it was just an absolutely stylish and thorough and comprehensive event with all of the most important voices on stage. And I was really excited to be able to be there on behalf of MakerDAOs, but also, representing the Refi ABC and our, what we're hoping to do for maker holders and for MakerDAO specifically. And of course, real world assets is an enormous part of that. You have been a partner with Maker. I know that you are so important to the Centrifuge team because people told me in terms of their relationship and understanding of what goes on here. And you and I have been in community in the pre-Endgame era. And so just a personal thank you again. And with that, I'll hand it off to you, and we'll have this conversation however you'd like to proceed.
I really, really appreciate it, Kianga. I actually have to share the thanks back because I'm very excited. This is my first ABC that I'm formally participating in. So it feels very cool because, right, with pre-Endgame, a lot of things changed. I was waiting for the dust to settle, trying to find the right place to slide in, and I appreciate being invited to be able to have this conversation. I will try to make this a conversational thing. What I'd love is actually questions and feedback on this. There are things here that I don't have the answers to that I'd like to figure out with Maker, or I need to figure out with Maker, and especially related to things like governance and how this fits into the endgame world, right? What I want to talk about is what At Centrifuge, we call proof of portfolio. I shared that forum post. You guys can go take a look at that. I'll kind of cover a lot of what's, that at a high level. I'm happy to dive into deeper parts of that. And I guess generally speaking, the way I'm looking at this and the way I'm thinking about it is this is really to me like an initiative or an experiment that's taking place within a prospective sub-DAO. Like, we have the sub-DAO cluster of real world asset enthusiasts. We are the Spring cluster. We've aligned on like really this idea of using blockchain to like innovate and disrupt traditional finance and kind of like credit rails. And a lot of that has been work that's been proven with Maker. And so that's what our sub DAO is about, right? And the proof of portfolio initiative, start getting into it, is really like an attempt to do a lot of the things we've always wanted to do. I think everyone who's thought about bringing real assets on chain has thought about how can I use the blockchain to make it more transparent, to kind of like, improve the processes and systems that are present here. But I think what's like really relevant or speaks to me today is that the real world asset work in Maker so far has been really incredible the last few months, actually. Like the end game has really kind of fueled, I think, this really maturity kind of process that's been taking place internally. And I think the state of real world assets in Maker is actually the best it probably has ever been, right? And that's no disrespect to anyone who's come before. If anyone's been involved with real world assets in Maker before, you'll know how difficult it was just for a variety of reasons. It was the first of the first of the first of the first. And so all of that like knowledge has been kind of created and exists here in the community, and we're really, I think, applying it in a really good way. One of the things that we noticed, talking about now, like the why proof of portfolio, why now, right? One of the things we noticed is that despite all of this, what I think is like a really, really good state of real world assets today, there's still difficulty in gaining full transparency into what's going on behind the scenes, right? We have these really good structures in place. I'm talking about really, the Andromeda portfolio. We have a system that now rightfully kind of governs the way arrangers interact with Maker. There is a trustee that acts as this independent third party. We've done a really good job on the reporting and the accounting, kind of like the financial, let's call it literacy of how we think, and I say we in the sense of Maker, we as a community and a protocol think about how to do things like Andromeda in that portfolio. But there's always this kind of need for how can we improve the transparency and visibility into it. And I think part of what proof of portfolio is getting at is that if we can create transparency in the way that I think crypto natives are used to, meaning that you can have data available in smart contracts that are executed on chain, and you can then kind of use those smart contracts as your, let's say, your source of truth, right? You can kind of put together the rest later, right? This is anybody who's done a little bit of chain sleuthing kind of knows how to look at a smart contract, see what happened, and then start deducing what actions happened external to this contract, whether it was off chain or on chain as well. That was kind of the incentive for proof of portfolio and starting to think about how we could do this. The name proof of portfolio, talking about now what is it, right? I kind of think about it as three things, right? The first step is taking the system that exists on chain or exists off chain, the structure of the real world asset deal that is Andromeda, and then bringing that on chain so that we're able to implement a trust minimized yet scalable version of that structure, right? What does that mean? Trust minimized, it's a buzzword. I really hate using buzzwords, so I'll try to explain that a little bit more here. The idea is we have these third parties that are playing these crucial roles about auditing and accounting for what's happening on chain. We have an arranger that's playing this trusted role for buying and purchasing securities and bringing them on chain for Maker, right? And then we have this Maker core team that's obviously managing and accounting for all this and handling the distribution of ultimately DAI for the collateral, right? There's a system that's in place today that I actually think works really well. But if we can make that system replicated on chain so that you can see exactly when Ankura, who's the trustee in this case, looks at something, signs it, attests to it, that's some data in a bank account somewhere. And then if you can capture that data in that bank account on chain somehow, if you can take the assets that exist in the portfolio, tokenize that and bring that on chain, in a verified way and say that, third parties are attesting that the custody of those assets is actually occurring in a way that it should be, right? Meaning it's being held by a qualified custodian. It's not being rehypothecated, which is like a problem, right? If you can start doing all those things and you can bring little bits and pieces and you have this on-chain representation, you know, does that help, right? That's the question we're asking. And I think the answer that I think we're getting to is I think that would help a lot, right? You would have the ability to go to the smart contracts and start seeing the data. And yes, you'd still have these third parties that are off-chain playing these crucial roles. By using the blockchain now as this like accounting mechanism and this source of truth, you actually can like recreate all the things that are happening off-chain in a more fluid way, right? And I think the key here is we're taking off-chain data, which could be like the attestation of a third party who's auditing some transaction, or taking bank account data that doesn't exist on chain, it's from private database of the bank, and we're trying to bring those numbers and that information on chain as well. What this leads to if you do this in a really granular way, right? Because there's also this, I'll acknowledge this as well. There's multiple ways to skin this cat. There's 1,000 ways to do this, right? I think lots of protocols in the world and even Maker efforts within Maker are working on auditing and accounting in a more trust minimized format, right? But if we're able to do this in a way where we have granular information about the assets in the portfolio, you then have the ability to start doing really interesting things, which I categorize in the automated on-chain decision-making category. So what does that mean, automated on-chain decision-making? If you can basically see the assets in a portfolio, you can accurately get the price of those assets. They're being fed in by an oracle, right? This is the classic problem with any assets on a blockchain, but you can kind of collect information about the individual assets in the portfolio. You can do the math on chain to then calculate what is the value of the portfolio that's holding these assets, the aggregate value of all the assets in my portfolio. And then you can actually then feed that data into other smart contracts that then are able to say, well, this value should be less, it should be more. We should actually sell some of these assets. We should buy some of these assets. We should rebalance the assets that exist across other portfolios. Thinking about things like stablecoins in the PSM, thinking about DAI held in the DAI savings rate, thinking about things like private credit versus the public treasuries, the public assets, and the liquid credits. You can start doing all these really cool on-chain things, right? And part of the end game actually has been focused on creating this. I think this is in the liquidity and stability scope, this automated ALM kind of programming system, right? Which looks at all these variables that I actually just mentioned and makes decisions. It's like an end state that the end game wants to get to. Well, if you're able to do all the stuff I talked about in the trust minimized kind of implementation of the RWA structure, and you get these granular details of the portfolios themselves, you can actually start interacting with these RWA portfolios in a dynamic kind of automated way as well, right? And so I'll summarize at the very end, but this then leads to this kind of third really interesting idea that we at Centrifuge think is maybe the most exciting idea, but also like maybe the furthest away today, right? Is once you have data and assets on chain in a trust minimized format, you have now decision making, or let's call it just ability to read and input and create inputs and outputs on chain based on that data that you have on chain. You have off chain data, you have on chain data. You can start doing really interesting things where you enforce like rules and behavior based on private but shared data related to that portfolio. So what does that mean, right? It sounds fancy, it's really not. Imagine take the New Silver portfolio. New Silver is a centrifuge issuer, so a close friend of ours. Today, New Silver issues bridge real estate loans, right? And there are actually covenants in his legal contract that enforce that he may not have overexposure in one state, for example. He can't issue all his loans in the state of Massachusetts, and this requires him to then build diversity into his portfolio, which is basically a risk management tool that Maker uses through the legal system to enforce better outcomes on the New Silver portfolio. If we do all the things I said earlier, you can actually then start enforcing this on chain. And that's like the real vision of proof of portfolio. This is why we call it proof of portfolio. This is kind of what we were originally driving for when we really thought about, okay, how can we do this in the best way? What do we actually enable when we do this? If you start taking and integrating off-chain data in a way that you can trust and make reliable, and look, that's a lot of work, right? And then you leverage that data in on-chain smart contracts, you can then actually start enforcing rules and behavior of your portfolio based on that data. And once you do that, what you end up with is this really, truly like this on-chain portfolio that one is more dynamic, it's automated, so it's more efficient. It can be managed by a smaller team because it's more efficient. And then third, maybe most importantly, you're actually reducing the amount of trust you place on any one party that's involved in this portfolio kind of management, including on the core team on the Maker side. You basically have this like triple entry accounting system that can accurately and adequately look at what's in the RWA portfolio and ultimately help make discriminate determinations on what should be happening to the aggregate Maker balance sheet. Now, that was a lot of talking and a lot of things, and I'm happy to go over that more. But basically, I think this is a vision and a journey, and this isn't like what we're going to be able to build tomorrow. But that's kind of what we're sketching out with Proof of Portfolio. And the idea for us was, can we use the sub-DAO structure, start experimenting with Andromeda, bringing that on chain, doing very simple things, recreating the structure in a way that's on chain that works well, and can we start working towards this kind of end state that I laid out here? But I'll stop there, Kianga. Tell me if I sound crazy or what.
No, that was terrific, and I want to encourage folks to put your comments and questions in the chat. I just have a few initial questions, comments, just to kind of frame this. So I think it is off the top really helpful that you specified that the proposal is targeted in the sense that you're thinking about this as a tool for, and this is a question as well, just sort of to clarify what the proposal exactly is, because I think we got a good sense of the vision. And what I thought was exciting about seeing your proposal is that, you're talking about something that teams that we all know, ecosystem actors, and perhaps even some of the facilitators, folks who are part of the day-to-day core of MakerDAO are already working on parts of what you've talked about. So maybe could you explain kind of what the actual proposal is in terms of, is it a product? Is it, how far along are you? And like, where are you seeing the need for approval? You mentioned there would maybe some amendments to the scope, sort of, you could frame out a little bit in that where we are.
No, that's a really good question, right? Because this really isn't a formal proposal yet. So it's a really good point. Like, what is the proposal here? Part of my thing I ask the maker community is understanding where's the right place to make this proposal. So I'll share the thinking that I've done so far to like identify how the proposal could come together, right? In very simple terms, what we're trying to do is we're trying to work with a partner of ours, a partner of our sub-DAO cluster, Block Tower, and we're just trying to improve the way Andromeda is being implemented today. And that, in simple ways, is just bringing Andromeda on chain. That's kind of the heart behind what the formal proposal would look like. It's like, effectively, let's say Andromeda is like a black box today. You don't really have to know anything about how it works right now. If, the idea is to take that black box, implement it on chain, make it more transparent, make it more efficient, make it more interesting from like a dynamic, integrations perspective, right? And this is all stuff that would then serve the needs of the people that have to manage Andromeda. That's one, the arranger, which is Block Tower. That's two, the facilitator of our sub-DAO, which is like, Steakhouse, those guys. And then three, it would be the auditors that have to work with the portfolio as it is today. That's Ankara, the trustee, right? That's kind of the proposal, like the constraints of it. There's a question about how this fits in to like the overall scopes and like the endgame atlas. I think Runa actually brought this up in a really good way. The way he envisions it is that these type of proposals should either support the atlas by providing data or take data from the atlas, like define components in the atlas and utilize that for the benefit of the protocol. Having talked about this with quite a few people now, I think my understanding is that this type of proposal is basically proposing almost a way of implementing data that can be consumed by the atlas and used elsewhere, upstream or downstream.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That sounds like a really important thing for us to maybe talk about a little bit in this hour. We have a bunch of delegates who've been attending those calls that Rune is starting to organize, and I've been joining them as well, as to the next generation atlas and the governance security stuff, and kind of how to structure these efforts so that folks are working in a coordinated way and that we get to that end state.
You also asked a really good question that I didn't mean to interrupt, but there was a question you asked that I didn't answer, which was, other people in Maker are working on similar parts of this. How do we like account and move, like, basically coordinate actions across all those things? We've been spending time talking to like BA Labs, who's doing reporting at Maker, talking to Powerhouse, who's building a lot of like accounting systems for like the Maker core protocol. And, I think the way this would fit in is really focused on the sub-DAO cluster, like today, the specific one portfolio within the sub-DAO cluster. And it could be a tool that integrates and ultimately is leveraged by either other like systems within Maker, or ultimately helps integrates with other systems, and whether that's Powerhouse or Maker Burn or whatever it might be. But there is like, I won't say there's a lot of overlap, but there's always kind of people working on different things from different perspectives and need to balance that. And I do think that's something that would be interesting to discuss today, and how we figure that out, like these cross governance tasks, right?
Yeah, totally. Let me. I have a direct thought on that, but before I go there, I want to just acknowledge Cloaky's comment in the chat. They say the limitation in this was when you were giving your overview about the, you know, the long-term vision, but that the limitation in such automation lies in the fact that the management of underlying RWA assets still requires full manual intervention. Therefore, can we truly consider it as automation? So maybe could you comment a little bit about how that tension of what really is going to be achieved when even in the end state with automation? And I think one of the comments, it might have been from Cloaky in your the discussion on your post of like, you know, input's only as good as, or the data is only as good as the input, and there's got to be sort of a trust but verify process behind this. And I'll just briefly tack onto that comment that I'm excited to see what Vote Wizard posted, who's one of our new governance facilitators yesterday, I think it was, and that it looks like the governance facilitators are beginning to structure themselves as these facilitator DAOs, and I think that's got to be part of the solution around verification, which is that the end game does provide a structure where there's like, you know, gamified or financial incentives for that kind of verification, so that as long as the data's in the right way and our UIs are the right way, you know, we hope that at the end of the day we'll have sort of armies of anons who will be doing that verifying as well. But you know, that's all part of this larger structure. But so I just wanted to drop that in. I was very excited to see how, and a bunch of you also in your, I know certainly Navigator and maybe some others commented about, you know, sort of that our transition with governance facilitators is going well. So just yeah, if you could, Assad, comment a little bit about what is being achieved with automation here on a manual reality.
Yeah, no, it's also like I think the most interesting question here, because there's like a question of like what can you truly automate in general about this stuff that's like at the heart of the question. I think that first the end state is a fully automated type of like portfolio management system. That's by no means the near term state that would be achievable. It will take a lot of experimentation and work to get there, right? What I do think is automatable though is all the stuff that sits between kind of manual processes. And when I say the word automation too, what I think of here is actually not trying to create a system that is the only system that works, but creating a system that provides like additional inputs and additional outputs that in their own way have their own qualities, whether they're more accurate, they're more dynamic, they're more real time, they're closer to a certain source of truth, whatever it might be, right? At the end of the day, if you think about like any kind of like system like this that has like really critical value moving through it, there will be redundant layers of kind of processes and intervention required. So the things that I think about is like one, the collection of data can be automated, I think, right? There is like a lot of work that can be just done on how do you improve the way the data is input and standardizing that. Like, you know, standardization of data collection, data outputs is really truly, I think, the most immediate automation, like low hanging fruit you can reach for. That may not be automation in the way you guys consider it, but that's what comes to mind immediately when it comes to like real world assets and what's possibly automated, right? Ultimately, over time, I think also that the like, let's say a near medium term state is that your portfolio tells you an indication of what should occur, right? The RWA manual intervention that occurs today is mostly stuff that has to interface with like traditional markets, right? So if you're buying and selling US Treasuries, for example, there's no way to fully automate that no matter what, because you have to at the end of the day interact with the system that allows you to buy and sell US Treasuries, that end system, which today is like, you know, far from automatable at all, right? But what can be automated is the portfolio indication that you should or should not be buying or selling, right? Today, those are decisions that get made looking at the aggregate, you know, and sometimes those decisions can actually be quite simple, right? We have like very simple rules that dictate when the stablecoin balance in the PSMs is a certain level, low or high, that money should be rediverted either from the portfolio, the treasury portfolio, into the stablecoin balance, or from the stablecoin balance into the treasury portfolio. That is not like a dynamic human reasoned decision that, you know, couldn't be automated, that easily could be automated and implemented, right? The end result may be that an arranger has to then like take, for example, the result of the portfolio telling he should do this, go and execute the transaction, and then ultimately bring the securities back on chain. But I think that's kind of the interesting thing that you would get if you had like an automated system in the middle. The full version where like the buying and selling is fully automated is probably like very, very far away. But that near-term state where the portfolio actually provides some hard, fast rules on which I think are fairly simple and easy to deduce, based on on-chain data, I think that type of decision making is automatable in the near-term future.
Yeah, terrific. Yeah, Bona Publica's plus wanting that. Also, so you did mention Powerhouse, and you're also working with Chronicle Labs. Could you say a little bit more about what's maybe occurred so far? But, we give us a picture. You probably know tons more about what they're doing than we do. So we're just dying over here. We're drooling. We're like, "Ooh, tell us." Like, you've talked to them. They exist. Where are you in those, I guess, collaborations, or
Yeah.
what do you think they will look like going forward, or what would you like for them to look like, and what kind of support, if you have a view, in terms of what you think kind of us on the governance side? I know that it may be a little bit new, like how we're organized at this point, but any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, and I can totally appreciate that it's like hard to see what's going on. I mean, this is like Maker governance for its entirety of its time being around. Like Maker's got so much going on, it can be hard to keep track of everything that's going on, right? Um, I think so where like collaborations with Powerhouse today, we've been having initial conversations about this. Like I guess taking a step back actually, where I would say all of these initiatives are still in really early stages of everything, right? Like you've heard me talk about proof of portfolio today. It probably is reflected that we've done a bunch of thinking about this and a bunch of conversations internally to talk about how to make something that like really works and like kind of magnifies the attempts of the end game. But it's obviously also clear that we haven't implemented anything. We haven't made a formal proposal or anything like that, right? I think this is true of a lot of the initiatives that are going on. So I think Powerhouse is in certain stages as well. They've built some software, they haven't built other software, they have a roadmap that they're implementing. Parts of the collaboration was to identify, okay, where are there points that we could collaborate, and then when could that occur, right? What we've identified today is that a lot of the work that Powerhouse is doing will actually be very useful because it will create this kind of general model where any ecosystem actor or even participant in Maker will have this ability to sign and attest to certain data coming from manual documents off chain, right? So then that can be used to basically improve like the accounting of, let's say, how money is distributed through core units and sub DAOs today at the Maker core level. But then we can also leverage that same system for the same types of verification that I'm talking about in like the real world asset sub DAO, right? The distinction there is that I think we're very focused on what our sub DAO is doing because this is where we have the most visibility and insight, and is also where we have the most like responsibility and accountability, right? Supporting that sub DAO cluster. And whereas Powerhouse is really looking at this from like a protocol level. So that's kind of where we've identified that there's possible integration points and like points to collaborate. I think the biggest takeaway I've had in my conversations with them is that they're like a significant stakeholder, and we have to work really closely with them to ensure that we're doing this in a really useful way that like works towards the goals that they're building for. Because I think what they're building for, like the DAO Universal DAO toolkit, is like really important. It's an atlas. It's also I think a really useful tool to integrate with.
Yeah, we want to have the network effects, right, of all of these structures interoperating. So when you mention your sub DAO, this is something that not everyone on the call might have the current iteration of, which is that if the sub DAOs, the sort of stand-in initial sponsored 6 sub DAOs have been kind of renamed. I don't know if everyone on the call has seen this, but we have the sub DAO 1 and 2, which are reserved for the emergent facilitators DAOs, and then sub DAOs 3 through 6 have been renamed. We have Sakura DAO, we have Spark, and now we have quantitative and qualitative sub DAOs, which I heard about this for the first time when I was in Singapore, and Runa presented this. So qualitative sub DAO and quantitative sub DAO, which are just sort of placeholder names, are the two RWA focused sub DAOs. Are you aligned at this point specifically with, have you identified with one of those two? Do you even know what I'm talking about when I say qualitative DAO and quantitative?
I do. I'm not. I can't. I would have to be like candid here. I'm not super in the loop on these conversations, but I
Okay.
believe our sub DAO is related to like the qualitative sub DAO today. That's kind of what we're focusing on, which is I think the intention behind the two distinctions there, quantitative versus qualitative, is to identify the different types of like work that they'll be doing. And so quantitative would be maybe like stuff that's super quantitative. Qualitative is more subject to like credit underwriting, right, which might be a more qualitative approach than quantitative. But I also know that there's possibilities that might change again, so I don't want to speak too much on that. Uh,
Okay, fair enough. I'm just looking at it myself, and I see that the post, Spring Ecosystem Actor introductory post is linked under the qualitative sub-DAO category on the forum. So yay. Let me look at the chat here. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're doing great on time. Let's see. There's some discussion. 0x Defensor, do you need any user feedback from us in the AVC? I believe many of us would be happy to participate and give honest feedback. Have you identified the potential core community members of the sub-DAO you are part of? We could help
yeah,
you find more.
it's a good question, right? Like I think again, like in the early stages of this, a lot of it was just figuring out those key ecosystem actors, and that's what our cluster was focused on. That was kind of like what we identified. Let's find the people that are working on RWA within the maker community that are like aligned around these same set of values. Again, the values of Spring are really oriented around implementing real world assets in an on-chain format. You're looking at that as the best way to do real world assets for both Maker and I think at large within the industry. That's what we're focused on. In terms of finding community members that are interested in that, like absolutely, right? Especially as we get to like the point where sub DAOs are really rolling out and there's communities being built and voting. I mean, I think it's super important to find the aligned people that hear what I just said and care about that and like also want to contribute to that in some way or another. So yeah.
So we have navigators typing while they're typing and you're typing. Maybe I could ask you also just for your experience of being involved in the maker community, and we used to have the weekly governance and risk calls, which was the whole ecosystem getting together, and we haven't, when the shift to the end game, we no longer have those calls, and as the governance is now organized kind of by aligned groups of MKR holders we are holding our own subcommittee meetings. And I just wondered if you would share any thoughts you have about community here at Maker. It's unique to have you because you're a counterparty, you're a partner, but you're also one of us. I mean, you are also very much Maker. And so yeah, I think we'd love to hear your thoughts about that and about culture and where you think we can improve with this new structure that's siloed, which I think has some really great benefits. I think it's improving alignment and like our ability in subgroups to get together and coordinate. But then of course now we have this other challenge of communicating across silos. And at this point, there isn't yet a neutral space where the whole community is coming together to kind of sync up.
Yeah, this is actually like you're touching on really interesting points. What you just said at the end there, like there is benefits to the way things are being structured today that the old GNRs couldn't like handle, right? And not to put it all on the GNRs because that's like saying it was all the product of them, but it was like many forces coming together, culminating in like the governance and calls, right? Generally, like here's my feeling: Maker before, actually even Maker today, I think is really like one of the few places across all of DeFi and crypto that is really good at having conversations. Sometimes it's too good at having conversations, and you get too many people talking at once about a single subject, and it can be hard to manage that, right? But it is this core value that like I've never seen recreated elsewhere that I think is a product of the way the protocol was originally developed and built and kind of really committed to this like decentralized ethos, which starts at like the level of community and making the forum like a transparent place to go. And I've been involved with other communities trying to create those same kind of outcomes. It's really hard to do, right? So in some ways, Maker's done a lot of the hard work to create this like shared culture of like communication, like really, truly, like focusing on how we communicate, being critical of others as you communicate, as well as just taking in a bunch of information, reading all the time. I mean, there is no place that is as good of a resource for like long, interesting reads as the Maker Forum, right? I think the end game's goals, the intents that I understand, I was kind of like really involved with Aruna early on in this, like seeing him develop this. Like, and I think one thing he's really nailed is that led to a lot of overhead all the time. Like you couldn't get into any conversation without having to deal with like the 127 other variables that conversation interacted with because it was all kind of this flat open pane, right? And then every time there was attempts to build structures within that, they would run into this wall where it would basically, it would conflict with the ethos of the DAO, and it would be really difficult to create productive structures. And then all of a sudden, and Runa talks about this all the time, those structures are fighting politically to like, justify themselves, and then maybe the politics becomes more important than the end results, right? So the one thing I see is that it's still early in the end game, but I think the siloed nature is like a benefit to a certain extent because it allows you then to not have to worry about the 115 variables, but maybe focus on the 15 core most important variables to you, and you can target those conversations within AVCs, right, and within the specific scope documents, within the specific subset of work, right. And I think having that inherent structure built in already is a better place to start to then try working your way up to then manage the overall protocol as a whole, right. I think what's missing for me, and this is like, it's hard to say this is a critique because like I said earlier, it's the first AVC call I've been involved with, so I'm just an outsider, right, and participating as much as I can within my scope. But I'm not really working on the tools of governance, which other people here are. But maybe what I see that is missing or needs to be better developed is this cross coordination function. I think, right, and I think that I imagine that will happen as the atlas gets more solidified and we have more like understanding of like here are the core pillars of what Maker's like future protocol will look like. Here's the 5 different areas we can work on it, and then we can start coordinating fluidly between those. But I always remember that the end game had this like resolution kind of component, and I think you even talked about it a little bit at the beginning of the call. And the resolution component was always supposed to be this thing that dealt with like this core unit actor is getting paid, or this ecosystem actor is getting paid to do these 5 objectives. This other one's getting paid to do these 3 objectives. Here's the objective results of what they were able to achieve. How do we now rebalance budgets, and like having kind of an objective, factual conversation about that to then allow maker voters to then vote on like the next iteration of what happens to those ecosystem actors. Those things are kind of like where I think the end state is. The end game is still working towards, and it doesn't have today. But yeah, it's like a really interesting place to be where you're working on, but I will say, Kianga, it's a huge benefit to have that culture embedded down here, that we can even have these conversations like we're having today to talk about what's going on and like, the impacts of it, right? Like we've already overcome so many hurdles even just to get here that like, that shouldn't be dismissed, I guess, right? I'm not saying you are, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, and I would say that the uptake of these aligned voter committees and committee members, we very early on in the beginning, pushed up the anonymity requirement for the delegates. You're probably aware, and so I think that it ended up being, really great that just got handled, ripped the Band-Aid on right away. And so, I mean, this is another dynamic that I think is improving. At first, the alienation, I think, for losing context, losing like familiarity with the people who are visible and involved, was disruptive. I think that that's improving, and that we have a lot of different personalities and approaches around these AVC committees. Very, very different dynamics. So we're in the midst of getting a lot of good testing as to what works both internally within our silos, and of course now the cross pollination of it. And for myself and Mike, who's here from Abundance DAO, who's working with us at MakerDAOs, and really wanting to refine, and you can see this in our governance strategy and the questions we pose, like how can we, each one of us, like you mentioned, Assad, like within your domain, we're part of this community, we're all sort of in our Venn diagram of intersecting dynamics with 24 hours of the day to get all the things done. how do we as an AVC add unique value, have a unique perspective? I mean, I think this is incredibly important. And so we have to figure out that balance of engaging across silos versus, what's generative that we can bring to the DAO, which requires certain external engagement. We need a certain amount of internal engagement. And I think where we see it in refi balancing out is definitely relying a lot on our ADs, our aligned delegates, but maybe not in the ways that you all are currently being utilized, right? I think a lot of pressure is put on the ADs to answer tons of questions. What do you all think about this? What are your recommendations for that? And I think, draft these amendments, which, makes sense given the early stage of things. But I think that the ADs can be that kind of like bumblebees in a garden, if I can use that analogy. And that as the voter committees can really have a very articulated point of view about the world and about Maker. And our delegates perhaps will be the ones that are at your calls with Powerhouse. Like if there were public calls that were more work calls, or in your sub-DAO, Spring Cluster, imagining a future where your tokens have launched and there's a lot going on there. Our delegates are going to be present there, and so the delegates will have a lot to do to be very present in all the silos. Because I'm not sure. I mean, speaking for myself, and I think trying to think about this role, not just for myself, but also in a way that it's going to be scalable, right? Assad and everyone here. The idea is not just that refi can be awesome, but that refi, and I've said this from day one, that refi it was more than anything a model for what is a structure for an AVC that will be adoptable, that does scale everything from what our responsibilities are to how the comp works to how communication works. If it's too hard and too much work and not fun, or whatever the dynamics are, too toxic, the people who are willing to take the pain are just not going to be a scalable number.
No, Kianga, I just wanted to jump in. I totally remember even before the end game started, when we were trying to manage all the complexity together, we had a conversation on one of the weekly calls. I can't remember which one it was. You were there, I was there. We're talking about trying to solve these problems, and you mentioned how overwhelming it can be, and you only have 24 hours a day, and that problem still exists, right? And so you're essentially saying, how do we do that from within this new structure, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that I think, but the sort of split that's occurred. I mean, in my mind, as we have, I should repeat this because I don't know that all of you have all the context. Is that I was formerly an recognized delegate in the pre-endgame system, and I really see endgame as taking that one role and really splitting it, right? Splitting it to the AVCs and the delegates. So I'm just, for those delegates that are on the call, suggesting that that cross-pollination work, I think is gonna, in the resolution of that, and I'm not sure how, but in my mind that really is part of the work of the delegates who are these sort of neutral conservers of the Atlas, and I'm not sure that at the AVC level we would have the bandwidth, or that structurally it's useful for us to know too much too early about conversations that are happening in other silos, because you kind of can't do both, right? We are either going to really understand our perspective as regenerative finance, and we want to, Mike and I have talked about, we want to be research based, we want to add value, we want to, some of our delegates were asking would our proposal at one time include, data, could it evolve to be a proper, scholarly white paper? I mean, all of those things take enormous amount of focus. And so that the delegates would really be the ones maybe in the weeds when it comes to knowing about what's happening in the silos.
I think it's an interesting discussion again, right? And like, again, I don't want to speak like I have all the answers, like the privileged answers, but I'll share my mental model and just like, maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, right? You can take what
Yeah,
you
yeah.
want, throw it. Um, I kind of look at it like the way to solve this problem is I think you're right. Like the core point of I think what I'm hearing and what you're saying is that we can't do what we were doing before, or we expect like these governance participants to own and know everything, and then also manage that, right? And and part of what the end game is trying to do in the structure and the silos as you're talking about is kind of create like domains of responsibility, right? But even now in the very very early stages of this, it's like not easy to see where those domains like are clearly defined or even how they integrate with the larger atlas as it's being developed, right? But when I'm like what I think of is when I think of the ABCs or even like the governance participants, wherever they exist in the value chain, right? Is that like, and this is kind of a loosey goosey way of saying it, so it's a little bit hipster. I'm sorry, but they're really like defenders of the culture, right? And that's not the domain they own. They have a domain like Refi, for example, and then what the governance participants are supposed to do is establish a culture that allows Refi to be the best it can be, right? And I think that's when you say things like, research focused, fact based, like experimentation, right? That's like, look, that's a kind of harkens back to the original like experiment based governance of Maker, the like original ethos of the governance team. I also think that's what needs to be recreated in Refi. And then what you do to leverage what you should be doing, at least in my opinion, is leveraging experts where they exist or when they're like involved and incentivized to participate as kind of the like the inputs and outputs that you need to then make decisions, right? So if you create a culture that allows experts to be able to speak, allows them not to be like attacked, harassed, and felt like they're being destroyed all the time, but actually, show themselves objectively and then allow themselves to be like evaluated objectively, right? And like, look, that's a whole battle in and of itself, even creating those conditions, right? And then knowing that experts are going to be, trying to game the system, right? But this is where I think the end game incentives and the way the end game is structured actually limits the gamification they can do, right? If I'm an ecosystem actor and I can only work within my sub-DAO cluster and I'm focused on the things that my sub-DAO cluster is focused on, and I'm accountable to the core facilitator that represents the Maker protocol, that really limits the amount of like, politics I can play, right? And so then if the governance of that sub-DAO cluster, and there's a question about governance of sub-DAOs, which I think is probably impossible to answer this early on, but if that culture is really open and really good about creating discourse that's productive around the things that I as an ecosystem actor are doing, I think you can get to really good results about whether I should be paid or not, and whether the actions that I'm doing are productive for the protocol and the sub DAO or not. Right? That's kind of the way I think about it because I think what's challenging about this environment the most, and I think where Maker's community has had the most friction and we've seen the most members leave and like the most attrition, has been that at times it can feel very antagonistic to be working when you're like supposed to be doing something and then you're also being held accountable to the community, you're also being held accountable to maybe your facilitator, and then you're also being held accountable to whatever external parties are involved with this as well, right? And I think that's where I've always noticed that the biggest challenges are, and that's a cultural problem as well as like a incentives and kind of structure problem as well. I don't think that's at all good answer, Kianga, but this
No,
is,
that's
I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
it's fantastic. Just having this discussion is amazing. And I want to recognize August and thank you for joining. And if you would be willing to come off mic and share your thoughts, that'd be tremendous. A lot of our participants, don't speak, and you certainly put some good comments in the chat and have important insight on this topic.
Yeah, happy to talk. And Khan, Assad, great to be talking with you
Dude,
again. It's been too long.
great to
Hope
have
you're
you.
well.
Yeah, no, great to have you here. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts because you're a new member of this as well that's been getting involved. So like I'd actually love to hear your opinion too.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I just put something into the chat, as I tend to do, a little bit of a ramble of a comment, but the TLDR that I'm seeing here is I think what we have is we have this trove of off-chain data, right? That we in the call it the on-chain world don't see. We need an oracle for traditional loan structures, which just doesn't really exist. So unfortunately, at this moment, there are going to be some trusted parties that need to be bound by old world legal agreements. So I'm thinking of like the Ancuras of the world in past deals. However, I think that party, so that verification agent, that monitoring agent, is really one of the linchpins in the entire equation. And whereas we're focusing on the criteria of what the reporting might be for the RWAs, we should really focus on what the criteria are for that Oracle solution, that human Oracle solution, right? And put in an approval process, be it going through a council, as well as a set of eligibility criteria, such that when a deal is brought to the DAO for a vote, it comes with a or multiple verification and monitoring agent that is then plugged into their local or their bespoke asset type, their bespoke deal type. And I'm thinking about this specifically. Let's take New Silver, right? So US mortgage loans, just to boil it, completely water it down. And then you have something like credits, maybe we're doing Colombian factoring receivables. You probably don't want the same person monitoring the mortgage loans in the US as the Colombian factoring receivables, right? Because those are night and day different asset types. So that's where I go to finding the right subject matter expert and developing a framework for identifying and approving that person.
Yeah, thank you, August, for bringing that up. And I think on the governance side, something I've seen is the frustration of not having answers. I think can lead to a lot of well-meaning folks wanting to provide ideas. And I think we've got to be slow and cautious and thoughtful about, even though it's painful, how do we get the right inputs so that we don't end up, kind of, I guess, wasting resources, building things that then don't work as intended, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I'd also ask, when we're looking at the ALM tiers, we have, I can't remember the cash convertibility for each of the specific 4 tiers in mind, but you can basically think of them as more longer dated, the higher up you go in the tiers. So 1 being US Treasuries and 4 being 4-year private credit, say. But why isn't there a specific reporting set of criteria for each one of the ALM criteria as well? And perhaps there is already, but I would think that would make a lot of sense because it's a way to bucket and say, okay, for US Treasuries, you can get that data in near real time. For a 4-year private credit vehicle, that's going to be a little bit of a more nuanced process actually generating that reporting, however, provided in as near real time as possible.
Yeah, I think it's actually really interesting to think about like what Maker is able to do today, like working with like liquid assets like treasuries, and then what they would try to do in a world of tomorrow. And I think it's also really important to highlight that you can't really take what's happening today for granted, given high rates, given the ability to like, also what Maker's trying to achieve, like using the DSR and things like that. You will ultimately need more bespoke solutions that are responsible for solving even something like one specific type of asset. And like so I think what Alkis is saying and like what Credix might be able to do versus what Centrifuge is able to do, like this is the world of RWA. It's a huge umbrella term, and I do think you need kind of these actors to be able to experiment and develop solutions within their realm of expertise again to be able to actually make progress. Trying to make progress holistically across the whole domain is like really really difficult. But then to August's point, you can do things like look at the ALM kind of standards and the behavior that's going to be implemented in a programmable way there, and start saying these are certain things that we can work on and can have expectations of our different RWA counterparts, for example.
Yeah, exactly. I think that there are blanket solutions and then there are bespoke solutions is the way I'm looking at it. And a
Yeah,
blanket solution could be something like you need to report in X number of days, you need to deliver payments in X number of days. And then bespoke solution is something like, okay, who is the one that's actually on the ground in Colombia, for example? And I'll also say, I'll put it out, but we actually just recorded another one of our Know Your Ranger videos specifically showing what we're doing on this verification and monitoring side. And I think it'll have, with some demos in there from our CTO, it'll have a really cool overview of what we're doing on the credit side that I think will add to this conversation. So I'll circulate that.
Great.
probably later today or tomorrow.
And I also think it's like really important, and I'll highlight this because I'm a big fan of August and what those guys are doing at Credix. Is that like if you ask Centrifuge to solve the problems that Credix is solving today, we would get nowhere, right? Like because Credix is working in a completely different market than the expertise that we have, and they're developing very good solutions, I think, for their market, which are different from the way places where we're specializing and spending our time. So it's really synergistic to have these different perspectives and views building together here. You know, one of the things that in August, I don't know, I think you're kind of saying the same thing recently, right? Is that one way of viewing the different like kind of parameter lines or the boundary lines here is that the maker protocol is responsible for certain constraints and expectations of RWA portfolios or RWA arrangers. And then there's actually kind of like a black box that exists behind the RWA arranger. And then arranger can do whatever they want or need to be able to come up with the data or the results or the behavior that is expected of them. But how they do that isn't necessarily the purview of the maker core protocol because it's so bespoke to their individual domain. And so kind of the work that I think Credix and Centrifuge are both doing on the back end here is working on improving those black boxes to make them more transparent, more efficient. And that's then meeting and providing inputs back into the Maker Core protocol, you know, in a way that I think is better for the RWA domain, but still meets the Maker Core protocol's needs without impinging on it.
Yeah, and it's kind of, I don't know if reflexive is the right word, the way I'm seeing this is that, you know, even for us to gain confidence at what we ossify at the core, right? What becomes part of the parameter or the rule set that is set, you know, close to governance, you know, where one day we'll have one executive vote a year or something like that. And then, you know, what are those things that are the domains of the sub-DAOs? You know, in some sense, you kind of we need you to be doing the work that you're doing now to have, you know, visibility into then, okay, well, this is what works, or this is, you know, I even don't even have the right language for this, but I just sort of see it conceptually, and I think it's important. And I would say from like a AVC perspective, and as delegates are making decisions, that we're very supportive of this kind of focus, right? That that we're sensitive to the nuances. And August, you know, what you brought up about domain experts, and Assad, how you're saying, like, look, we're really honing in on the sub-DAO. You know, we're not proposing some big solution for all of the atlas, you know, but we're going to improve on, you know, where we're sitting, and that also then is a style of working, is a way of trying to manage these risks and improve these systems altogether. Folks are typing.
There's a lot of good conversation in the chat.
There are good conversations. Our video, I think, captures the chat. And always the chat stays the chat. So if you're watching the recording, you know, just feel free to hop on in to the Discord voice channel, and you can read all this stuff yourself after the fact. But yeah, so go ahead. Was that you?
Sorry, Young, if I may. I would add one more. It's kind of a defensive factor, right? So what we've seen a lot is, forgive me, but the term belly aching comes to mind. A little bit of belly aching over the reporting and the misunderstanding of when things need to be reported and etc. However, if we are to put in a framework of, okay, you can expect this data by this time, and if not, then this happens, it's just a very clear, straightforward way that folks don't have to then poke and prod and say, when was this due? Why isn't this here? If we're all on the same schedule for each ALM tier, then that question is answered. And I think it takes pressure off of the third party agents that we contract to actually monitor and attest to these assets, right? And so it makes Maker a little bit more of a friendly environment. And to Khan's point a couple of minutes ago, it makes the DAO a lot more approachable, and then you can get more reputable parties to even work with everybody.
That is such an important comment, and I know, you know, True Name, it's something that you've pointed out, and I hope that this meeting is a good example of improving in that area. Friendly. I mean, that's definitely something we want to contribute. Constructive tone, and I think it's extremely important that we manage we mature as a culture, because it's very crypto native, maybe how combative or we can be at times, but our vision of however gigantic this project is going to be in the future, we definitely need to manage, I think, some of that, to have a more approachable and constructive dynamic. And so, yeah, I think that this is something we really, really going to care about in this community here. And it's going to take all different ABCs, and different groups who will nerd out on different things. We're going to nerd out on culture and social consensus, and legitimacy, which is in our governance strategy. And I feel like, we've talked a little bit about how important that is, which is like your feedback, like and this is something that's some of our delegates have mentioned in their communications, that we can pass, you can get something to pass in the Atlas, but or through a poll, we want to really make sure we have the right buy-in, so that you all who are doing the work and building products and our counterparties are really informing the rule sets that we put in place. That's incredibly important to this AVC. So want to thank you both, and thank you, August, for joining, and Assad, obviously, yes, for being our special guest today. And any final comments? I guess what's our takeaway, ADs, or Assad? What did we accomplish in having this meeting, or what points us to, I guess, how we can be useful in moving the ball forward from the perspective of Centrifuge?
With respect to our proposal, which I don't think is the only thing that matters here, right? I think I've gotten a better understanding of like some of the feedback, like Cloaky's conversations in the chat are incredibly useful to understand like what's desired and what isn't, right? Again, this is early stage experimentation, so he's also kind of asking a certain way, like justify the value of automation more, right? I think that's a really good discrete point of feedback for the proposal that I know our cluster would appreciate a lot, right? How to formulate that, how to think about that, how to actually answer that question. I think there's also a lot of good discussion what we just had about how to work with the ABCs better. I don't really know if I have a discrete answer there, Kianga, but more of these is kind of like the answer I'm hearing. Like we should be spending more time talking in public and talking to each other. And yeah, I think that's my biggest takeaway. August, what do you think?
I think it's these open conversations right now. And then I think once clear standardized reporting does come forward, it will be extremely valuable. But for now, I think it's going to be folks like Centrifuge and like Credix kind of pioneering a new way of doing things, because right now all legal docs and all processes are open source, which is great. And we need to set a precedent based on that. So let's have these conversations in an open forum and give recommendations in real time. And then ultimately, once they're ironed out, draft them into the documents. But clear guidance, I think, is the real critical aspect right now.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think we'll have a big leap forward. I know that lots of stuff is happening behind the scenes, and for us, I'm sure very soon when we start seeing some of that hit the public, when we get a look at some things, that'll be a big help. All right. Well, I think that'll be it for this week. Thank you, everyone, for attending today and for your participation. And let's keep it going async. And everyone have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Hey, everybody.